In this module, we will be talking about the binomial test, and we will be looking for the testing procedures that will be followed through this test. So students, binomial test is one of the non-parametric tests that determines if the proportion in one or two categories is different from the hypothetical proportion valued, which is usually 0.5. So binomial test is a goodness of a test. Binomial test is used in those situations where we have data for which the variable for which there are two possible categories. For example, success or failure. For example, if we are talking about any certain item and we categorize it as being defective or non-defective. Similarly, if we are talking about certain MCQ type tests and we would have to choose for the true option or the false option. So if our data would have certain kind of category, students, so we can test this type of data using the binomial test. Now, my dear students, binomial test that takes into account the binomial probabilities. So the binomial probability is being given before you. It is the probability of x at x, where capital X is the discrete random variable that will be taken under binomial random variable, and its values are denoted by small x. So students, probability of x at x, it is equal to NCx p raised to x q raised to n minus x. And as you can see that x is starting from 0, 0 meaning no success, 1 success, and so on. Now here n is the sample size, x stands for total number of successes, p is the probability of success, and q is the probability of failure. Students, before applying the test onto certain data sets, first of all, we would have to look onto the assumptions which are to be fulfilled with our data sets. So the first assumption is that categories are nominal and dichotomous. For example, success or failure. Now by dichotomous we mean which can be cut into two. If we have only two possible categories for particular variable, so that will be known as dichotomous. For example, yes or no. For example, pass or fail. So these are all possible categories of a certain variable. So these type of variables will be known as dichotomous. And why we are talking about nominal scale of measurement here, students? Because if we are talking about success or failure, we can place the success first or the failure at last. So these are just the names of the categories. The next assumption is that the sample has to be a random sample. Then observations are independent from each other. And finally, the sample size has to be less than that of the population size. So if these assumptions are satisfied with certain data sets, students, so we can apply binomial test onto those data sets. Let us look up to the binomial testing procedure for that matter. So students, apply करने से पहले इस test को हम सबसे पहले देखेंगे that what type of steps are required to follow this particular procedure. Let us suppose if we talk about step number 1. Step number 1, students, we formulate the hypothesis. Now, which hypothesis I'm talking about? The null hypothesis, which is denoted as H0, and the alternative hypothesis, which is denoted as H1. So, null hypothesis में students, अगर मैं पहले pair की बात करूं, it is P equal to P0 versus P not equal to P0. Now, what is this P? This P is basically the population proportion, and P0 is the numerical value which is being assigned through this population proportion. So students, अगर हम साइंस पे गौर करें, null का साइन है equal, alternative का साइन है not equal. So this particular pair of hypotheses that falls under two-tailed test, because the probability of rejection is on both of the sides, on the right hand side as well as on the left hand side. If we move on to the next pair, students, so इसमें देखिए P greater than equal to P0 and P less than P0. So only one of the tail is being specified, and this is a directional hypothesis. So this is a case of one tail test. And same as with the last pair, it is also a one tail test example. Once we have decided under step number 1 that whether we are following the two tail test or one of the one tail test, then we move on to step number 2. Under the step number 2, students, we have to decide the level of significance, which is being denoted as alpha. So students, alpha को हम type 1 error भी कहते हैं. Type 1 error is the probability of rejecting H0 when H0 is true. So alpha is predetermined before following any experiment. Moving on to step number 3, test statistic, where X denotes the number of successes. Under the step number 4, students, we would have to have the critical region. Critical region is basically the rejection region that would guide us where to reject our values. So we will have to reject H0 if p-value is less than alpha. Now what is this p-value? P-value is the probability of x being less than equal to small x. Students, आजकल whenever you will be following the computer software for testing the hypothesis, which will be following later, the computers would give you two values. One is the critical value, which is to be compared with the tabulated value, and the other value is known as the p-value, on the basis of which we can reject or accept the null hypothesis. Under step number 5, we have to calculate the p-value out of our sample data. And finally, under step 6, we would have to make the conclusion whether to reject or accept the null hypothesis on the basis of the comparison of the observed p-value, which is the alpha, and the calculated p-value that is to be obtained from the sample. Once we are done with that, students, then we would be able to reject or accept our null hypothesis using the binomial test.